All right, folks, let's talk about Louisiana v. Callais, the Supreme Court case, which essentially gutted the last provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And I've heard a lot of consternation. I've heard a lot of kitchen table articulations of this. Quick flashback. Back in the fall of 2004, I was a college sophomore, and the first big civil rightsy thing that I did was intern for Reverend Jesse L. Jackson and Attorney Janice Mathis with the Rainbow Push Coalition, pushing through the Voting Rights Act reauthorization in 2005 that was signed into law by George W. Bush. I was very smallly part of putting together the massive march and nationwide protest and rallies that were necessary to draw the public attention to the fact that we needed this crucial piece of legislation in place. And what I can say is, I do not want to hear much from Democrats about them bellyaching and bemoaning the impact of Louisiana v. Callais. The reason is that we knew from that time in 2005 with the reauthorization that there was going to be a full-fledged judicial assault on the Voting Rights Act. They had failed to let the clock run out on it. They had failed to legislatively overturn it. And they knew that they simply needed to get a hold of the Supreme Court to be able to get rid of the Voting Rights Act. And they ran on it. They campaigned on it. They campaigned on getting rid of Roe versus Wade. They campaigned on getting rid of affirmative action. And they campaigned on getting rid of the Voting Rights Act. And they have done all of those things since returning to power. After the Shelby v. Holder cases back, over a decade ago, the Supreme Court gutted what was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. What that required was that southern states and 16 other jurisdictions that had previous histories of discriminatory conduct had to have federal preclearance before changing their voting lines. So you see all of this switching around. Florida just announced they're changing their voting lines. Texas changed their mid-decade redistricting. Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, they're all following a line after this decision. Well, prior to Shelby v. Holder, the federal government actually would have had to approve any changes to those maps. The Supreme Court struck down Section 5 in Shelby v. Holder during the Obama administration. Now, this is the interesting thing that people are not talking about. In that same decision, you can read it for yourself, the Roberts Court kicks back to Congress and says that they needed to craft a new Voting Rights Act, one that did not use the statistical evidence and the information from the 1960s, but one that was updated for the new century, and to pass that. Because remember, Congress can override court decisions with legislation so long as they go by the constitutional bounds which are put in place by the Supreme Court. Did they do this during the remainder of the Obama administration? No. Did they campaign on this in 2016? No. Did they do this in 2020 when Joe Biden got into office? No. We actually had the John Lewis Voting Rights Act during the Biden administration. We added every amendment till it became the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act. We tried to push it through, but we couldn't get other Democrats to get on board with making it a priority. Not saying they didn't support it, but are you going to make this a legislative priority that we are going to put blood, sweat, and tears and sacrifice into doing? The problem was that they saw voting rights as simply being a black issue. And because they saw it as being a black issue, they didn't think it would play well in the suburbs, so they didn't want to put any money behind it to make sure that those laws got put into place. They didn't want to do things like twisting the arms of Joe Manchin and Christian Sinema. They didn't want to suspend the filibuster so you could get it through the Senate on simply a party line vote. So because of that, that's what brings us to where we are right now with the diminution of the Voting Rights Act and the redrawing of these lines. But nay, I will not let you have doom and gloom in the situation. I want you to learn and think about what they are actually doing. If you are in, let's say, Tennessee, and you take an area like Memphis and cut that into 3 different Republican districts, the only way that the extreme MAGA Republicans maintain power is if we do not actually register and turn out in record numbers. You see, what they didn't think about when they were doing this is the fact that now those extreme MAGA Republicans are going to have to ride into Memphis and start campaigning to those people because those people are now in their district. The same thing with New Orleans in Louisiana. The same thing with all of these states around the country that are taking majority African American areas and cutting their districts up in order to incorporate them into extreme MAGA Republican districts. So given that you have a president who is at 35, 36% in the polls, because you have an extreme MAGA agenda that has been riding around kidnapping people, dragging children into detention centers, shooting people in the streets, because you have an administration that's launched a war in Iran that's driven gas prices to nearly $5 a gallon nationally, well, these new lines might end up biting the extreme MAGA Republicans in the ass. Because if we get out there and do the work, if we register the voters, if we educate voters, if we make this an actual priority both in 2026 and in 2028, then we can take back the House, we can take back the White House, and we can take back the Senate. And if you do that, then on day one, the priority has to be you dust off that John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act, and you pass it through on a party line vote by suspending the filibuster on day one. And you don't just restore Section 5, you don't just restore Section 2, you update it to address the new methods of voter suppression and voter intimidation that we're seeing coming out of the extreme GOP agenda that has been taking place. And then also that we need to take this moment to reflect and invest in state and local parties on the progressive side of the aisle. Because during the course of the Obama administration, during the Obama years, Democrats lost something like 1,044 state and local seats nationwide. You saw a state like Georgia, where I'm at, create a constitutional majority for Republicans in the House, in the Senate, and in every single statewide executive elected office during this period of time. And you saw this in state houses and governor's houses across the country. That is what set the stage for what we're seeing now. Because the Democratic Party decided they were going to suck all the money out of the state parties because it was so important to elect national Democrats, because at the time it was and still is. But we allowed these state and local parties to be hollowed out. And at the same time, you had Tea Party groups, you had the proto-MAGA groups, you had these outside organizations, billionaires, Talking Point USAs, the extreme right-wing grifter sphere out there, motivating these local elections, running candidates in these local elections to ensure that they could take these state houses, the same state houses that are now voting on redrawing these lines. Don't try to put the fire out after the house is already burned down, which is essentially what people are trying to do now. You have to see the first signs of smoke. You have to see the first ember that might light that thing on fire. So now that the house is burned to the ground, that we don't have a protected right to vote in the year 2026, the year of our Lord, that means that we have to rebuild on that same foundation, learn the lessons of what we did wrong, and now turn that corner to create a new, stronger, and better voting rights set that respects the rights of every single American. Let me know what you guys think.